All right, so I think I'm recording now. And you should be able to see presentation. Can everyone see that? Give me a thumbs up if you can see it, just so I know. Lovely. We have to play charades when we're on mute. Okay, so welcome to the Roots of Yoga talk presentation. So today we're going to be exploring some of the roots of yoga. Obviously, yoga is a huge subject, so we won't have time to cover everything in 1 hour. That would be madness. But I'd like to give you sort of a taste of the origins of yoga pre-Patanjali, pre-sage Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras. So before we dive in to examine yoga, the yoga of Patanjali and early yogic practices, it's necessary to have a little bit of an understanding of the 6 classical schools of Indian philosophy, of which yoga is one. So this gives us the context to understand where yoga sits in the philosophical landscape of India. So there are 6 orthodox schools, and they're called the Yoga Darshana, Samkhya Darshana, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. And these philosophical schools are referred to as darshanas, which means viewing, because these philosophies involve beholding or viewing sacred knowledge or wisdom, this sort of spiritual knowledge. And the orthodox schools accept the authority of a very ancient group of texts from the Indian subcontinent called the Vedas. And because they accept the authority of the Vedas, they're called the Astika schools. So you might be wondering why we're not seeing the Buddhist and Jain traditions being listed, but that's because they don't accept the authority of the Vedas. So they are called the Nastika schools. So the Vedas, the word Veda means knowledge, and the Vedas date from around the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. So they're from around 2000 BCE, a very, very ancient body of texts. But actually a lot of the Vedic knowledge, the Vedic wisdom, would have been around before they were written, and that wisdom would have been passed down through oral traditions. And these Vedic texts contain evidence of philosophical speculations and ritual ceremony and practices, and some really beautiful philosophical writing is evident in them, which we'll look at shortly. But the beginning of sort of systematic schools of philosophy, these schools in particular, didn't actually begin until the 2nd century, so AD. So those of you who went to school quite a long time ago, we use AD and CE mean the same thing. So from the 2nd century of the Common Era, flourishing into around the 6th century of the Common Era. So it's not the space to explore all these different schools today, but for the sake of our study, in brief, I'll just touch on yoga, Samkhya, and Vedanta, and say a little bit about each one of those schools. So yoga is a philosophy which deals with all the levels of one's being. Striving, in the practice of yoga, we're striving to experience the eternal center of consciousness and separate out spirit from matter, pure consciousness from the material. That's really important, that separation, that dualism, that we want to separate the two, spirit from the material realm. Samkhya philosophy offers a framework for all the levels of manifestation, from the subtlest to the grossest, and is concerned with the liberation of spirit from matter. So that's the source of yoga philosophy. We see a connection there, that concern with separating pure consciousness from the material, we see in both Samkhya philosophy and yoga philosophy. So yoga philosophy is born of Samkhya philosophy, the Samkhya Darshana. Vedanta literally means end of knowledge. So if the word Vedas means knowledge, Vedanta, end of knowledge. And Vedanta provides contemplative methods of self-inquiry, leading to the realization of one's true nature. And its wisdom is best captured in the Upanishads, which is one of my favorite texts, and in the great sayings, the Mahavakyas, which you might be familiar with. We have expressions in the Mahavakyas such as Tattvamasi, thou art that supreme consciousness, that supreme truth. Aham Brahmasmi, I am that Brahman. So that's just a little introduction to the 6 philosophical darshanas. Now, what is Samkhya? So it's important for us to have an understanding of Samkhya when we study yoga. So Samkhya philosophy is the root of yoga philosophy. And Samkhya was founded by sage Kapila in the 6th or 7th century before the Common Era. And then the ideas of Kapila were expounded in the Samkhya Karika by Ishvara Krishna in the 4th century of the Common Era. And now Samkhya proposes a metaphysics and ontology that is fundamentally dualist. And I said this before, and this is really important to understand, this dualist philosophy, the separation between matter and spirit. And yoga has inherited this key distinction. In non-dualist schools, such as Advaita Vedanta, this separation isn't there. Matter and spirit are one. So just to go a little deeper into this idea of dualism and why it's important to understand the separation. So Samkhya proposes that reality is comprised of 2 separate principles. Purusha, pure consciousness, this principle of pure consciousness, pure self, and Prakriti, the principle of pure materiality. And this can confuse yoga students because we're living now in this kind of new age era where everything is one and non-dual, but actually this separation of the 2 is important because when we conflate Purusha and Prakriti, it leads us to suffering. So when we mistake the seer for the seen, we begin to suffer. So this relationship between the subject and object, we want to make them return to their own source. So Purusha to return to its source and Prakriti to return to its own source also. I also want to mention the gunas, which we see in yoga philosophy as well. According to Samkhya, all matter, all Prakriti consists of these gunas. So we have sattva, rajas, and tamas. So sattva means purity, balance. Rajas means fire, movement. And tamas means inertia, dullness, and darkness. According to Samkhya, all matter, all Prakriti consists of these gunas. And when Prakriti is in an unmanifested state, these 3 gunas are in equilibrium. When their equilibrium is disturbed, the phenomenal world begins to make its appearance. And it's also the root of change. So the flux of these gunas can have a profound effect on our lived existence and on all the nature that surround us. And they are the most subtle qualities of nature that underlie all matter, life, and mind. And they are the energies through which not only the surface mind, but our deeper consciousness functions. And the gunas, it's important for us to have an understanding of the gunas. Also in yoga philosophy, we see it there written about in the 1st chapter of the Yoga Sutras. Samkhya is called Samkhya. Samkhya philosophy, means the root of the word Samkhya means to count or to enumerate. And it's so called because it enumerates 25 tattvas, or true principles. And these principles represent a map to the innermost self. And here we see the, sorry, got a little alert coming up on my laptop. And here we see the 25 tattvas. So I don't want to overload you with this, but some of it is relevant to us as yoga practitioners. The tattvas are a map to the innermost self, and the concern with the tattvas and the concern with this framework is with the emancipation of the 25th tattva, which is the Purusha, the soul. So here we see the first tattva, which is Prakriti, so matter. We have Purusha, pure spirit, pure consciousness, and Mahat, which is wisdom, Buddhi, also known as Buddhi, Ahamkara, so the ego, the I self, Manas, mind, which is the grosser level of the mind, the thinking mind. So we're going down into the more grosser elements of being here. The Jnanendriyas, which are the sense organs, and the Karmendriyas, the organs of action. And then we have the Tanmatras, the subtle elements, and the Mahabhutas. So that those last two, the Tanmatras and the Mahabhutas, are possibly the ones that we don't concern ourselves with so much when we start as yoga practitioners, but we should have an awareness of the other aspects, the other tattvas in our yoga practice. And we're using these grosser elements to access the more subtle, the more refined aspects of being, until we can finally get to that point where we separate out Purusha and Prakriti. Okay, so moving on, just going to have a sip of water. So what early yogic references can we find? So what references can we find to yoga pre-Sage Patanjali? So I wanted us to look today a little bit at the Upanishads. I've mentioned before that the Vedas are a body of texts from around the second millennium before the Common Era, but not all the texts were written as early as that. So the Upanishads is the final chapter of the Vedas. There are four main parts of each Vedic text, and the Upanishads always appear in the last section. And the Upanishads date from around the 8th century before the Common Era up to the 1st century of the Common Era, so that the last part of the Vedic canon to be composed. And there are about 12 principal Upanishads. Some people dispute that and say that there are more, but there are 12. I sort of think that there are 12 that are particularly beautiful, so that number makes sense to me. And it's in the Upanishads that we see the first detailed descriptions of yoga, of yogic practices, and proto-systems of yoga. And we begin to encounter some important yogic ideas. One of the first things that we encounter is this idea of the internalization of sacrifice, of tapas. So tapas can be translated as austerity or discipline, but a truer definition, I think, is inner fire, an inner fire that is purificatory in nature. And in the Upanishads, there's a clear move away from ritual and sacrificial fire. So in the earlier books of the Vedas, there's a lot of writing about ritual, about sacrifice, about ceremony. And all of those things were very much conducted under the auspices of the Brahmin caste, so the priestly castes, the elite castes, who had a real monopoly on Vedic knowledge. But in the Upanishads, we see a move away from that, and the idea that the ritual fire can be transplanted to an inner and unseen realm with an inner heat, an inner tapas produced by yoga, to purify. So we see here a societal shift in which aesthetics sought to liberate themselves and were not dependent on sacrificial ritual and those priestly castes. So in that, we're beginning to see a shift away from outer rituals to a more inner, egalitarian, private inner practice. And we know now that that's the result of increasing interactions between different castes and different groups of society, between ritual priestly castes and new ideas from developing adjacent non-Vedic cultures during the same period. So although Vedic culture began in the northwest of India, it gradually moved eastwards, where it encountered new Shramana movements. And the word Shramana means renunciate. The root Shram means to strive or to exert. So a Shramana is one who performs acts of austerity. And these Shramana movements, these Hermetic movements, were developing around the area east of the Gangetic Plain, referred to as the Greater Magadha region. These Shramana movements developed around the 5th century before the Common Era and included new groups such as the Ajivikas, the Jains, and the Buddhists. These groups crucially explored the idea that suffering is born from activity, and so one must abstain from activity by disengaging from society and conventional comforts, and this Hermetic idea. Jain practices could include standing in the sun for days on end or fasting for long periods. Other key Jain ideas were those of ahimsa and non-violence. Buddhism focused more on desire as the basis of suffering. So it's likely that through contact with these groups, there was a form of sharing between Brahmins and Shramana groups about transmigration and about liberation. And so we see that dialogue being reflected in the Upanishads. We also learn about karma in the Upanishads. So the Upanishads introduced this as a new theory. And according to this theory, one was responsible for the accrual of merit or demerit in life, according to good or bad acts. So the notion of a ritually reserved place in heaven was replaced with that of reincarnation determined by one's karma, determined by one's actions in life. We also have some references to yogic physiology. There's references to Shvasayam, breath control. We also refer to it now as pranayama, so control of the prana, control of subtle energy, and the nadis, the subtle energy channels in the body. The Upanishads also introduce the idea of the Atman, the inner self, one's true identity that's hidden from ordinary perception, and Brahman, the cosmic principle, the ultimate reality, pure consciousness. So I wanted to look at a couple of quotes from different Upanishads. We have here the Katha Upanishad, chapter 6, verse 10. We have an example here of pratyahara. When senses are firmly reined in, that is yoga, so people think. From distractions, a man is then free. For yoga is the coming into being as well as the ceasing to be. So pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses, being a key part of the yogic practice. And we see here a charioteer holding onto the reins of horses that are kind of going wild. And this is a way that we can see the horses. And in the Bhagavad Gita, we have a similar reference that the senses are like a scattering pack of horses, and how much we have to rein them in to involute, to go inside, and that is the true path of yoga. The next Upanishadic reference that I've put here is with the nadis from the Chandogya Upanishad. 101 the veins, the nadi of the heart, one of them runs up to the crown of the head, going up by it, he reaches the immortal. The rest in their ascent spread out in all directions. So subtle energy channels of the body being referred to. From the Mundaka, we have the calm and wise people in the wilderness who live a life of austerity, of tapas and faith, go through the door of the sun to where the immortal self, the Purusha, is. So we have here an idea of renunciation, of a kind of clue about more ascetic lifestyles in the Mundaka. The Mundaka also outlines a sixfold system of yoga that preempts Ashtanga yoga. We'll look more at that later. And then finally, if I can say this, because it's quite hard to get out of the mouth, Shveta Shvatatara Upanishad. I won't read all of it, but here we have references to breath control, Shvasayam, and the environment in which to practice yoga. So compressing his breaths in here and curbing his movement, a man should exhale through one nostril when his breath is exhausted. A wise man should keep his mind vigilantly under control, just as he would that wagon yoked to unruly horses. Again, we have this idea of the senses and the mind is kind of going off and needing to be reined in like horses. And the environment for practicing yoga is also described: level and clean, free of gravel, fire and sand, near noiseless running waters and the like, pleasing to the mind but not offensive to the eye, provided with a cave or a nook sheltered from the wind. In such a spot one should engage in yogic practice. So if only we could find somewhere that peaceful and pleasant to practice yoga in today. It sounds quite idyllic. The other text now that I wanted to look at with evidence of yoga is actually quite a lot later from the Upanishads. So I want us to move on now. So we started by looking at Samkhya philosophy, and then we jumped back a bit to explore yoga in the Upanishads. Now I want to look at another really important text from the Indian subcontinent, which outlines yoga and yogic ideals. So the Bhagavad Gita was written in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and it's part of the Mahabharata. It's part of the 6th chapter. And this text, even though it's said to contain all the nectar of the Upanishads and hold the distilled wisdom of the Vedas. So it's very much connected with the Vedas, but we get the nectar of the Upanishads and the wisdom of the Vedas transmitted to us through story, through a really engaging story. So it's set on the eve of war and recounts a dialogue between the Pandava prince Arjuna and his charioteer Krishna, who turns out to be none other than the supreme godhead Vishnu. The story centers around Arjuna's ethical dilemma in entering into a battle against his extended family. This reflects larger tensions in the epic and in society between ideas about individual human freedom, self-autonomy, and between renunciation and action, specifically the action of svadharma, so one sacred duty. Arjuna is a kshatriya. So the kshatriyas are warriors in the varna system, in the caste system. We have Brahmins, priestly caste, kshatriyas, the warriors, vaishyas, the merchants or skilled workers, and then the shudras, which are the unskilled workers. So as Arjuna is a kshatriya, it's his sacred duty, his dharma to fight, even though he's faced on the battlefield with members of his own family on the opposing side. So he's really in a moral kind of quandary here. He doesn't want to kill members of his own family, yet it is his dharma to fight, his duty to fight. And in the Gita, Krishna educates Arjuna on correct right action according to dharma, according to one's sacred duty, And he does this by initiating Arjuna on the path of yoga. So Krishna extols the virtues of different types of yoga and offers different definitions of yoga. For example, as equanimity, as ease in action, as renunciation and detachment. And the text also distinguishes different types of yoga. So we get a taste, an understanding of karma yoga, the yoga of action, jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, and bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion. And actually, one of a teacher of mine here in, he's at Oxford, called Nick Sutton, he sort of said the other day, which was a bit tongue-in-cheek, that it's like Arjuna doesn't really get it at the beginning. Like, what is this yoga? What are you trying to teach me about? He's not understanding. So Lord Krishna is offering different margas, different paths in yoga to try and help Krishna understand, and explaining it in different ways until he's understanding what yoga is, and until he's understanding what dharma is. And I've got one little quote that I wanted to share with you, as I really like it, and it helps me a great deal in my own practice and life. But this is on detachment. It's from the 5th discourse of the Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna says, yogis, having abandoned attachment, perform actions only by the body, mind, and intellect, and even by the senses, for the purification of the self. So it's quite self-explanatory. I don't need to really say so much about that, but exploring this idea of detachment for purification. So now I would like us to move on to look at the Yoga Sutras and look at who Sage Patanjali was, and introduce you to the Yoga Sutras. What are the Yoga Sutras? Why are they important to us, etc. We'll start by looking at Sage Patanjali. So sorry to disappoint you, because I feel like maybe I did some false advertising and telling you that you were going to learn all about who Sage Patanjali was, but I can't really do that because there's very little information available to us about Patanjali, and nothing can be said with historical certainty. And that can be baffling for us Westerners, because we're so accustomed to detailed biographies on literary heroes, and this anonymity can be inexplicable and somehow negligent. How can we not know? How can we not have any information about him? But in India, this is the rule rather than the exception. And that means that popular imagination can really run wild around these literary heroes. And India is home to a rich compendium of myths and legends because of that. And there's a lot of mythology and legend around Sage Patanjali. And when we look at these stories, and we look at any stories about any key figures in Indian history and spirituality, it's really necessary for us to spend our discriminating Western minds, because often the symbolic meaning of these stories can be a really powerful tool in learning about the figure in question, about learning about traditions and values. And what can seem like far-fetched tales, upon further reflection, can be said to hold great truths about human nature and about the world in which we live. And given that we're studying the nature of reality and the nature of existence as yoga practitioners, really we need to come at this with a very open mind. So the first story of Sage Patanjali that I wanted to share with you is that of Gonika. So Gonika, we see her here in the waters. This is the story of Sage Patanjali's birth. Gonika was a very worthy woman, a very intelligent woman, and she was a devotee of Lord Vishnu. And she was a very, very devout devotee of Vishnu's, of the Vaishnava sect. So Vaishnavas are is the name for devotees of Vishnu. And she was also a adept yogic practitioner, and had acquired many yogic skills and powers through a long practice. And she was desperate for a son to pass on her wisdom to share her knowledge with. But she hadn't been lucky. She hadn't had one yet, hadn't been able to bear a son. And she would go to the river every day to pray to Lord Vishnu, please grant me a son. I will do anything. I am desperate for a son. And she would pray to him with her hands in Anjali Mudra and pray for him to bless her with a son. And she would do her oblations in the river. So she would make offerings, and she would purify herself in the water and make her prayers. And Vishnu saw this, and he took pity on her, and especially because she was such a good, loyal devotee and so skilled, so worthy, so humble, he thought, she's deserving of a son. I will give her a son. And so out of the skies, out of the heaven, dropped sage Patanjali. It must have dropped in a very, very small baby form, because she opened her Anjali Mudra and caught him in her hands. To fall in Sanskrit is pat, and then her hands opened from Anjali Mudra. So he became called Pat Anjali, Patanjali. And that is the very endearing story of Patanjali and his birth. And it's said that he then learnt yogic wisdom from her, and he became a skilled yoga practitioner, a skilled yogi, a skilled sage, a muni, from her wisdom. Another part of this story of Patanjali's birth, Patanjali's coming into existence, is the story of Adi Shesha, and that this story connects us with the familiar iconography of Patanjali as seated upon, the base of him being made up of a snake. I'll show you here. I don't know if you can see because he looks quite dark, but his lower part of his torso is a coiled snake. So why do we have this snake, and where does that come from? Well, it actually comes from another part of the story of his birth, or another, sometimes seen as a separate story, and it can also be connected to the one that we've just learnt about, the story of Adi Shesha. So who was Adi Shesha? Adi Shesha was a giant serpent, and he was a consort of Lord Vishnu, and he was a very devoted consort of Vishnu, and Vishnu liked nothing more than to lie upon his snake. And we see here Vishnu doing exactly that, lying upon his snake. And one day Lord Vishnu was watching Lord Shiva dancing as Nataraja, dancing his cosmic dance. And Lord Vishnu went into, just was finding it so beautiful, and was so enraptured by it, that he went into a state of samadhi, and of bliss, and he started to tremble, he started to shake. And Adi Shesha, upon whom he was seated, was thinking, this is very annoying. What is all this trembling? I'm being completely disturbed here, and there's so much noise. Why won't this trembling stop? Because Vishnu was just trembling upon him. And finally, when the trembling came to an end and the music stopped, Adi Shesha said to his master, Lord Vishnu, thank goodness that stopped. What was all that? What was causing that commotion, that trembling, that noise? And Lord Vishnu said, I was watching Shiva as Nataraja dancing his dance, and I was in bliss. It was just so beautiful to me. And Adi Shesha said, my lord, I wish I could please you like that. I would love to be able to bring you to that state of bliss. And Lord Vishnu said, you have been a loyal servant to me, a loyal consort. Your time will come. And he rewarded Adi Shesha by sending him to earth, incarnated as Patanjali. And it is said that Patanjali then became a very accomplished dancer as well as a yogi. And this, yes, it connects us with this iconography of Patanjali because we have the serpent coil here. These iconographies are called murtis. So it's any symbolic icon or statue of a deity. And this murti, this iconography, became established of Patanjali around the 13th century of the Common Era. So it's been around for an extremely long time. In the story of Patanjali's birth, often these two stories of Gonika and Adi Shesha are linked together. So some people like to tell the story that when Adi Shesha dropped from the heaven, he came first as a baby serpent into Gonika's hands, and then was transformed into a child later. So they can be put together. But when I was reading around Patanjali, I found so many stories about him, and then a lot of them there's slight differences and tweaks here and there, and people just can take the story and sort of make it their own. Before we move on to what we can say, I'll just tell you that it's said in the legend, in the myth and the legend, that Patanjali, yes, became a very accomplished yogi, that he wrote the Yoga Sutras, and that he also became an expert on Sanskrit grammar and on Ayurveda. And that he was, because he was born into a Brahmin family, he had excellent command of the Sanskrit language and was well educated. In some stories, it's said that he then went off to a celestial mountain called Mount Sumera and married a lady called Lulupa. It's said that he was so powerful in his speech that he could reduce people to dust and ash. He could make them go up in flames just with the power of his words. There are some funny stories, really brilliant stories that I read, many, but we can't go into all of them today. So I'll let you discover them if you want to go a little bit further into reading about Patanjali. But now I think to just look at what we can say. So I've already told you that we can't say that much with historical certainty. And no one knows exactly where or when he lived. Some believe that he lived around the 2nd century before the Common Era, and that he wrote those texts on Sanskrit grammar and Ayurveda. However, based on analysis of language of these texts and divergence in linguistic details, that's been rejected by modern historians, and they place him they place him firmly actually in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And this is possibly going to flummox you, given that we recite the invocation at the beginning of yoga classes, where we say that Patanjali wrote treatises on yoga, Ayurveda, and Sanskrit. But actually, according to historians, those works on Ayurveda and grammar were most likely written by Patanjalis in different regions of India. So it's likely to be many different Patanjalis, and that's also the same for the sage Vyasa. It's said that there would have been more than one Vyasa, so it's not uncommon to have multiple historical figures sharing the same name. But yes, he certainly would have been born to a Brahmin family to have the knowledge of Sanskrit. Pali was also spoken and in use at that time. Sanskrit was very much the language of the Brahmin caste. It's most probable that he then renounced his background to become adept at yoga and yogic practices. So possibly he was tired of lofty principles of the Brahmins, and he rejected that to explore different ideas from the Shramana movements that I've already spoken about. So there's aesthetic wandering groups that were conducting yogic practices. And what's really important to say is that there wasn't like a homogeneous practice of yoga. It wasn't one it wasn't systemized in how it is now. He actually did that. He compiled and synthesized practices from different aesthetic groups and practices, even as we see from the Upanishadic texts, which are so old. These yogic practices have been really around for a very long time. Our Guruji BKS Iyengar describes Patanjali as a Svayambhu, which means an evolved soul incarnated of his own will to help humanity. Because obviously we're talking about a culture that believes in reincarnation. And so Patanjali had that volition, if I can say, or had that ability to decide to be incarnated in order to help us, to free us from suffering. So moving on now to look at the Yoga Sutras. So we're coming now to our final subject of today's presentation, today's class, and we'll be finishing with a little exploration of the Yoga Sutras, a bit of an introduction. So here are some of the things that we're going to look at today. So relevance to us, some commentaries, and a reference to Light on the Yoga Sutras, which is the main text that we use when some of us come together to talk about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So, and there's Guruji's book there on the left. So what are the Yoga Sutras? The Yoga Sutras, as I've said, were compiled by sage Patanjali between the 2nd and the 4th century of the Common Era. So the text contains 195 terse aphorisms. This phrase is used an awful lot, terse aphorisms. That just means that the verses are dense and they are concise, they are compact. Each verse has many, many layers of meaning that can be extrapolated. So what might seem like a really simple phrase, a short verse, can have a huge meaning. And one of the reasons for that is because the Sanskrit language is multi-layered, and Sanskrit words can have many different meanings and are much more can't think of the expression, but they're much more subtle, and they're, yes, as I said, they're different. We can even read the Yoga Sutras in different ways according to how we interpret the Sanskrit words. And in ways that our language isn't. It's in a subtlety in the way that our language doesn't have, Sanskrit has, certainly. And the Yoga Sutras represent the pre-existing teachings of yoga that have been systemized in a really coherent way. The word sutra is linked to the word suture, which means to stitch. So we have the stitching of ideas together as the sutras unfold, and as the chapters unfold, we see that there's a kind of, as I said, there's a coherence to them. They connect, they stitch together. I really like this quote by Seth Powell that my friend Georgia sort of directed me towards about yoga and the Yoga Sutras. Broadly speaking, it is a philosophical treatise on the nature of mind, human suffering, and a systematic approach towards attaining complete spiritual freedom, or the isolation of pure consciousness, kaivalya, through the attainment of highly concentrated states of mind, samadhi. So that's by Seth Powell, who heads up the Yogic Studies School. And here he's talking about what the Yoga Sutras are. BKS Iyengar comments that the sutras cover all aspects of life, beginning with a prescribed code of conduct and ending with man's vision of his true self. So he says of the Yoga Sutras, as individual drops of rain contribute towards the formation of a lake, so each word contained in the sutras conveys a wealth of thought and experience and is indispensable to the whole. So there really he's suggesting that each word has many facets to it, and that we should accept the whole text and not just part of the text. And that can be quite difficult sometimes, to suspend our disbelief at some of the more metaphysical aspects of the Yoga Sutras, especially in the third chapter, which talks about the powers and the siddhis, the powers, the kind of magical abilities that one can gain from advanced practice of yoga. But Guruji is really encouraging us to accept the whole text and not just pick bits and discard the rest. So now I'd like to just touch upon commentaries, because there are so many commentaries out there on the Yoga Sutras. And I've listed just 3 of the early commentaries here and some modern commentaries. So the Yoga Sutras have prompted a really rich commentarial tradition, and particularly in the medieval period that followed. And the commentaries, basically, they're also referred to as bhashas. There's the Sanskrit word for commentary or glossary, and these unpack the meaning of each sutra, and they help the sadhaka, the spiritual aspirant, or can be a lay reader as well, make sense of what Patanjali means. And sometimes they just take the form of, a simple commentary, but sometimes they take the form of kind of a debate or dialogue representing 2 different ways of looking at the sutras, sometimes with someone posing questions, and then with another person or the author assuming the voice of someone else answering those questions, or those even sometimes resistances to what's being put forward. So sometimes as well they provide examples of what the sutra might mean in practice, or use allegory to explain. So B.K.S. Iyengar uses stories to help us understand the Yoga Sutras. Vyasa's commentary was the first to be written, at least 1500 years ago. And it explores Patanjali's intentions and teases out the meaning of each verse. He was writing for an audience that would have been much more familiar with the language and concepts of the Yoga Sutras, and possibly they would have been more advanced in their practice than we are. So Vyasa's commentary can be a hard text for those students with no background in Indian philosophy and yoga. And actually, funnily enough, even though so many commentaries have been written since then, he goes the furthest in his explanations of what the Yoga Sutras actually mean, which is very much because he was a product of that environment and most likely practicing, and most likely had a far more advanced understanding of what yoga actually is. These commentaries can be immensely helpful in understanding the sutras. However, it's really important to remember that texts can be read in different ways by different lineages, and we have commentaries given to us from different lineages. So, for example, a commentary by someone from a pure yoga or Samkhya dualist lineage will differ from a commentary by someone from a pure Advaita non-dual lineage. I've put an image of Swami Vivekananda here because his commentary is relatively modern and it's very, very famous, but it kind of manages to make it does make a non-dualist reading of what essentially is a dualist philosophy, as I said before, that yoga is a dualist philosophy, and he is coming from a Vedantic background and makes a non-dualist reading. So the teachings now of the Yoga Sutras. So this is a much quoted, much cited phrase, sutra from the Yoga Sutras. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. So this is really often given, some people just give this as the meaning of what yoga is and sort of leave it at that. But this is the second sutra of the first chapter in the Samadhi Pada. There are 4 chapters, 4 padas of the Yoga Sutras, And this Samadhi Pada outlines the importance of the practice, abhyasa, of yoga, and detachment or dispassion, vairagya, from worldly attachments that draw us away from our true nature, as being the methods to achieve this cessation. So those are two things proposed by the first chapter: to cease the mind from its shakiness, to cease the mind from its fluctuation. The first chapter, the Samadhi Pada, also talks about what these 5 key fluctuations of consciousness are. Each one is elaborated on. The gunas, which we saw from Samkhya philosophy, sattva, rajas, tamas, are also described, as well as God, or Ishvara. Ishvara is also defined, and 4 types of samadhi. 4 types of samadhi. Patanjali also lists some of the antarayas, the obstacles in the path of yoga. And this chapter is very much directed to those who are already practitioners of yoga. So the clue is there in the title, samadhi, those who are really already going for samadhi, not so much on the initial practical steps and technique in the sort of kindergarten of yoga. They're already they've graduated onto the next stage. So often people who train as yoga teachers, when they go to their yoga teacher training, they won't be shown this chapter first by their teacher. They'll be shown the Sadhana Pada, the second chapter, that will be more applicable to them because it gives the practical tools, the much more accessible techniques to becoming established or sort of steady yoga practitioners, yoga sadhakas, spiritual aspirants. So the Sadhana Pada tells us of various practices we should do to accomplish yoga, describes Kriya Yoga and the 8 limbs of yoga, Ashtanga, and also talks about the kleshas, which are the deep-seated afflictions that disturb the equilibrium of consciousness. The third chapter I've already mentioned, which is quite hard to grasp, explores the divine effects for the practitioner of yoga sadhana as they begin to acquire supernatural powers, the siddhis. The Kaivalya Pada is about what life is like for the person who has traveled this path and who has entered Kaivalya, so ultimate freedom or liberation. The Sanskrit word Kaivalya means separateness and refers to the state of liberation that the consciousness of an individual, the Purusha, achieves by realizing that it's separate from matter. So finally, we come to our last slide before some discussion. I wanted to touch on the 8 limbs of yoga, which appear in the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras. These are the practical steps for us in our path of yoga. They include yama, which are the ethical restraints. The yamas include ahimsa, non-harming, satya, truth, asteya, non-stealing, brahmacharya, which is celibacy or continence, aparigraha, non-greed, non-grasping, non-covetousness. So these ethical restraints are more social and relational. The niyamas are more ethical observations, and they're about self-discipline. We have saucha, which is purity or cleanliness, also purity of thought, cleanliness of thought. Santosha, contentedness, to be content with what we have. Tapas, asceticism, I mentioned this before, inner fire, inner heat for purification. Svadhyaya, which is self-study or the study of scripture. And Ishvara pranidhana, devotion to God, devotion to Ishvara. We also have asana in the 8 limbs, which is what we go to classes to practice. So asana means a seat comfortably held. If you'd be familiar with seeing the postures, it's the source, the root of modern postural yoga as we have it today. Pranayama, it says here, breath control, but pranayama is control of the flow of prana, of subtle energy in the body. Pratyahara, withdrawal of the senses. and dharana, mental fixing, mental concentration, dhyana, absorption, meditation, which is when the mind is fixed through extended lengths of time and the mind enters a state where there's no disturbance and the focus is steady. And samadhi, perfect concentration, when perception becomes crystal clear and one-pointed, facilitating the highest level of realization. And these steps, they've been put here, they're there in sort of sequential order, going from the top in kind of, well, clockwise, that they should be followed in that way, starting with yama, and we develop from those restraints and those observances to the next stages. So it's a logical sequence for us as practitioners to follow. The sutra is now in application. So for the last part of our discussion, I'd like to invite you to come off mute when you're, if you would like to comment on these sutras. I'll read them, and then I thought we could talk about how they can be relevant to us. So I've chosen 2 sutras that I particularly like, one from the first chapter and one from the second chapter. The first one, Maitri Karuna Mudito Pekshanam Sukha Dukkha Punya Punya Vishayanam Bhavanatash Chitta Prasadanam. Through cultivation of friendliness, compassion, joy, and indifference to pleasure and pain, virtue and vice respectively, the consciousness becomes favorably disposed, serene, and benevolent. The second sutra that I wanted to look at is Avidya, Asmita, Raga, Dvesha, Abhiniveshaha, Kleshaha. The 5 afflictions which disturb the equilibrium of consciousness are ignorance or lack of wisdom, ego, pride of the ego or the sense of I, attachment to pleasure, aversion to pain, fear of death, and clinging to life. So these are the kleshas, the afflictions, the most sort of common afflictions that we experience, very much part of the human condition. So yes, I'd like to invite you to come off mute. I think I want to keep it up on the screen. This I want to stay on shared screen so that you can see it. But if you would like to now tell me what you think of these sutras, if you see any relevance to you just in your everyday life, whether you're a practitioner of yoga or not, I'd be really happy to hear you if you want to offer any comments or thoughts. Now I can see you. I had to hide you at the bottom because it was getting a bit distracting. I'm going to guess that either Lucy or Andrew want to speak, because Andrew's got his hand up. Lucy, you look like you're posed, you're ready. Or Georgia?
I think Lucy's got something in the chat.
Oh, in the chat. Can I go to the chat? Goodness, I feel 100 years old. I never know how to use these.
She can't get it off.
Oh, I've done it. I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh. Okay, so nice to hear someone else's voice other than my own. Yes, if you have anything, because it's all very well and good to talk about the philosophy and to talk about, to do lengthy discussions about what the Yoga Sutras are, but really, what do they mean for us?
Can I just ask you a question, Charlie?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's quite interesting because you were talking about Patanjali, that the sutras could be interpreted in lots of different ways. And do you think that was part of his thought? Well, who knows what his thoughts were when he wrote them such a long time ago. But do you think that interpretation, or the difference of interpretation, was part of his philosophy behind his theories, that he wanted people to interpret the sutras in the way that they want to interpret them? In other words, apply them to themselves, that they have like a dual meaning, more than a dual meaning.
That's really interesting. Possibly. I mean, we do get, when we have our discussions here, we have a sutra group and we talk about our interpretations, and they can be quite divergent. And in the commentaries themselves, we get very divergent commentaries, as I said, because each lineage will read the Yoga Sutra slightly differently. And yes, perhaps the Sanskrit language can give us space to, it's like poetry, that we can extrapolate different meanings from a poem. It can mean different things for us. The Sanskrit language is so poetic in that way that it's kind of unavoidable. I don't know if that's an intention of Patanjali or just a product of the nature of the Sanskrit language. I don't think he's trying to confuse us. It's a really good question, and I'll have to say, I mean, I can't be sure. I can't know. I mean, because
well, no one knows what he thought, obviously. But those two that you've got up on the screen at the moment, which clearly can be interpreted in different ways depending on who you are and where you are in your life. Too, actually, an age comes into that as well. And it's quite interesting that maybe that was the intention behind them, that they can be interpreted in any way that you would like to interpret them, so that they have some meaning to your life as you are.
I think that's really interesting, because you can reread it as a text many times and you'll focus on different things. So even you could take one sutra and just sit with it for a week or 2 weeks, and different parts of it will be relevant to you at different moments during the week. It might be that certain words, certain phrases
resonate. They resonate at a time in your life.
For example, the abhinivesha, the clinging to life, doesn't just mean fearing death, like I'm fearing dying at the end of my life, but it's also fearing change, the death of anything. So we can kind of we can really explore each sutra. Really, we can get very detailed in our explorations, quite very deep with each sutra, with each verse. Thank you for your questions. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask, or comments about these two sutras? Andrew, yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering if sometimes when texts descend from lots of different places like that, lots of Patanjalis, there can be quite conflicting texts or divergent texts. And I was wondering if what had come down to us was actually a slight variety in what Patanjali or the Patanjalis were all saying, or if there's just one literary text now.
There's actually a lot of and I don't have the exact details in front of me now, but there is a lot of debate around whether or not the whole text can be attributed to one Patanjali. And there's a couple of verses that are seen to have been added later that don't quite fit. And I think that's been, like modern, I can never say the word, philologists, studiers of language, have informed historians that actually linguistically it can't, that there are one or two sutras that cannot be said to be part of the original text. Yeah.
If it's only one or two sutras, that's quite impressive, because the texts themselves can get quite flexible as they get passed on and written down. Yeah.
I can't say exactly how many and give an exact answer on that, but I know that definitely there is that's something that has been debated, and that there are parts of it that are said to be not belonging to the main body of the Yoga Sutras. Does anyone have any comments on these two sutras themselves, or any yes, if they'd like to make any remarks about what the Yoga Sutras have meant to them, or anything like that?
I was just going to say, and I need to remind myself what the first 5 are, but Edward Bryant, who you mentioned earlier, a friend has been going to some lectures by him, and he sort of starts by saying that the first 5 sutras, they give you everything.
Yeah.
And everything else is just embellishments.
Yeah. I mean, I find that really difficult it very difficult, because I think, I mean, there's so much, and it's so much more subtle than just you take the first 5. But certainly the first 5 are focused on the different types of the vrittis, the different types of mental fluctuations. But I think for us to really gain something from the Yoga Sutras, I mean, unless you're, I feel like we're so gross, we're so dull, we're so unenlightened now where we are, if we really take it that the Vedic era was sort of the height of civilization, we are fallen. We need all the help we can get. We need this whole text, and we need all the practical skills. And actually it's the second chapter, as I said, which actually gives us the techniques. It's a practical text. It's like a manual. So I feel like we need it. We need all of it. Maybe the Vibhuti Pada, the next life we can focus on getting those spiritual powers. maybe we won't quite manage that in this life. Okay, so I think we should bring things to a close now. Does anyone have any further questions or comments to make? No?
That's really interesting, actually. Thank you very much indeed. That's really, really helpful.
That's all right. Okay, well, it was nice to see you all, and I wish you all a pleasant Diwali. Have a lovely time, lovely day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.